So Matt Covington is going to be talking about a Big Pine Lumber Company is the tour for this evening. Matt, I've learned is a really interesting guy and a multi-talented individual. He's a fine arts photographer, an electrician, a home repair and renovation DIY guy, and a backpacker. He's also a busy practicing attorney who has a delightful sense of humor. So Matt, with that, I'll go ahead and let you launch into your Big Pine story.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, everyone. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, so this is my presentation on my layout, SN3 layout. I live in Belmont, California, the peninsula between Stanford and San Francisco. It's a freelance logging layout. Here's an initial just photo to get everybody kind of situated. It's loosely based on West Side and also the SP narrow gauge in the Sierras in the 1930s or 40s. And again, it's not a prototype, but a freelance focused on logging. I'm going to talk a little bit about the inspiration for the hobby for me. It started, when I was really young, like 6, like most people, and, migrated from a loop of track on plywood to an in-scale layout when I was, early teen, just before a teenager. And then eventually in high school, I got bit by the narrow gauge bug when I read some model railroader articles, some by Malcolm Furlow in the 80s that had kind of wild scenery and artistic, interesting, and that was inspirational to me. I was starting into my other major hobby, which is photography, which would later become a fine art photography hobby that became very serious. And so I was interested in the artistic side of things. I also like building things, mechanically inclined. And so this was a, perfect hobby. And so I read those articles with great interest and started my first narrow gauge layout, an HON3 layout in the 80s, built in my parents' garage. So on the right side is a Furlow photo of one of his mills and mines, and my scratch building effort on the left-hand side in HON3. I actually went back and found physical photographs I had in an album and was able to scan them. So it was kind of fun to go back. This kind of set a foundation for some lessons learned that I would take on and use later in the SN3 layout I'm going to be talking about. Though this layout back in the 80s was, super small, parents' garage, flex track, early SN3 locomotives that were, didn't run very well. A lot of the modeling techniques were pretty similar to what many of us use today: open grid construction, hydrocal castings. I actually have some photographs from that, hydrocal castings taken. They didn't have Bragdon back then, so I went out and used the kind of latex material that I painted over local rocks and made molds out of them, and got a lot of people staring at me kind of crosswise when I was doing that. But these turned out really, really well. So here's a couple of photographs of some shays running on in some of the trestles on that layout. Uh, the early brass locomotives, as people probably remember, were terrible runners. I tried my best at airbrushing this beautiful brass locomotive when I was 18 and adding wipers and everything to it, but it never ran very well. Um, so that was kind of the hobby until I launched off into college, and the hobby went dormant, like it does for a lot of people. Went off to college, law school, started a career, um, and but the hobby resurfaced again later in about 2006. Um, at the time, I was about 40 with a lot, busy law practice with young children in a new house. And I had been focusing on fine art photography as another major hobby. And I had taken from the other house this huge stainless steel sinks and enlargers for the photography project, and they were all in the garage at the new house. And I didn't know what I was going to do with them because digital photography had come along and had kind of made all of that obsolete somewhat. So I was trying to figure out what to do with that space and thought, why not get back into model railroading? So with limited time and limited space, I wanted to figure out how I was going to engage in the hobby in a meaningful way without overloading, taking away time from my family or my business. And my father, who was a modeler as well, had suggested this great idea of, he called the bite of the hamburger concept. In other words, something you don't need to eat the whole hamburger to be satisfied. You can have part of it, and it'll taste just great. And so, build something you can build in a reasonable amount of time. A relatively small switching layout out and back with focus on highly detailed scenery, and so this is what I did. And the drawing below shows in the top portion, and it's hard to see, the top two arrows show the existing layout, which is approximately 22 feet by 10 in a horseshoe configuration with highly detailed scenes, log pond, log camp, logging operations, but it doesn't fill the rest of the garage. And the bottom part of the layout, the areas called the planned expansion, show the areas that will eventually roughly double the size of the layout. That just in the last 2 years I've been working on and planning to expand. With the help of folks from my local operating group that Dave Adams is the head of. And everyone in that group has provided lots of interesting ideas. Um, so getting into that, here's the existing layout information. SN3, I mentioned all of these points about freelance logging. The equipment is mostly PBL because it's SN3. I've recently acquired one of 6 Berlin Locomotive Works Mason bogies that were ever made, and got a decoder in it and got it running, and uh, fixed a number of things. So it's waiting to be painted. The rolling stock is a combination of PBL kits, Leadville design kits, some freelance rolling stock. And one other thing that I've done that's of interest is it's DCC, it's NCE operated, but because I don't have any way to operate trains continuously, I don't have any loops or loop backs, and I wanted to be able to run trains in an automated fashion. I came across NCE's mini panels, which are about no, people don't know what they are. They're about $60, and NCE developed the electronics, and they're a programmable circuit board effectively that you can program basic code into to have the train have the NCE system call a particular locomotive, tell it to run a certain speed in a certain direction until it hits a certain detection point, and then to stop and reverse and throw switches and run up a switch ladder. And so I've developed a pretty complicated set of commands for these mini panels that will run the layout automated, um, at least when it's running correctly. And so those are fun things to do, and to watch the locomotives run back and forth through this switching layout. Here's an overall view of the garage layout room. I sheetrocked it, added insulation, recently just re-epoxied the floor to get things ready for the layout expansion. The existing layout is shown in the back. I've got this on rollers so that I can move it out. It's very heavy with all the hydrocal, and put in and maintain the backdrop, which is a photographic backdrop shown in the scenes here. And there are about 20-foot long backdrops that I shot on high-end digital camera while backpacking and printed on a 40-inch inkjet printer that I use for my photography. And that blends very well into the scenery that I've built there. We'll see photographs of that later. And in the foreground are butcher paper mock-ups, one-to-one of the two large sections. The one in the foreground will be a large town that has a fair amount of industry. We can't see the rest of it. That's maybe 20 feet long. And then the other module is maybe an 16-foot long mining district that will also be built. We've talked about most of these points. Again, uh, I designed this so that the backdrops could be accessed and put in valence systems and lighting so that the viewer's eye is focused on the scenes. Again, my desire was to really create highly detailed scenery that really was a showcase for the models, where you're not distracted by other visual elements. Other constraints in building this were my wife's insistence, and very reasonably, that we'd be able to eventually still open the garage door if needed. So I had to build a system where I can get that in over the layout. We have two cats that would constantly make their way into the layout. And so I ended up building a stick framing, a stud wall room for about 3.5 feet of the garage by about 8 feet where the cats reside, and a door into the layout room. And again, I mentioned refinishing, most of that room. So talking about construction, starting in the early 2000s, like many of us, it was not very linear. I made more changes along the way than I wish I had, but they were all improvements. Adding visqueen in places to keep dust down, adding an 220 air conditioner and heater system. There is a section that you'll see later that I call kind of the High Sierra area, a town called Tioga, that I later added after I started building the mountains at the suggestion of John McKenzie, who came by and said, "Oh, this is a really great opportunity to build a smaller logging, operation up here." Uh, a number of the mountains on the front of the layout were redone after I perfected the technique. So I had to tear a bunch of hydrocal out. Um, and, I did a lot of the wiring for the mini panels and changed the lighting several times to get it just right. Um, so the photo backdrops we'll also talk about were um, more of a trial and error than one might imagine. I talked about recently re-epoxying the floor to try to keep dust down, putting the layout on larger casters so I can easily move it around if we ever move, and also to get access to the backdrop. Um, Building out the layout room. It's pretty mild in the Bay Area, but having air conditioning and heating is really helpful. Here is the cat room, a framed out and sheetrocked room with storage and access for the cats with a door that goes into the layout room. And that's really helped dramatically. One time I went out before this and was working on the layout next to a tunnel portal, spiking down some rail, and I thought something was watching me and I couldn't figure out what it was until I looked up and saw two little cat eyes looking at me through the portal. And luckily, he didn't, manage to get into the rigging on any of the spar trees. It would have completely destroyed it. So I decided to build this wall out at that time. Here are some photographs, early photographs of building the layout. Uh, Again, open grid construction, the backdrops, the valence systems, rough forms for some of the mountains, and in the foreground, a rough form for the large canyon that is in the front of the layout. We'll see photographs of this later. Um, Again, I talked about building this in sections and having it on rollers so it could be moved if we happen to leave, the house. Um, The backdrops were a lot of work. I started by painting them, trying to spray in clouds. I'm somewhat artistic, but I can't paint like draw very well, so that didn't work. But then I started working with photo backdrops, and as I mentioned, ended up printing these. They're like 2 GB files on a 42-inch photo quality inkjet printer. And I printed these on canvas, so they're pretty durable and they have really low sheen, so they look kind of more like paintings than photographs. And tried a number of different scenes in the Sierras that for these sections of the layout. One early image was from Death Valley, really beautiful, but it didn't quite fit what I was trying to model, and so I ended up uh, really finding solution. One weekend we were backpacking as a family in Pinecrest, which is in the west side of the Sierras, and came across a really great overlook with beautiful clouds. And I didn't have my large camera with me, so I came back 2 weeks later, packed out there again for 2 nights, and waited for the right light. And that turned out to be the final backdrop. This is an early photo of some of the scenes from Death Valley that were trial backdrops that I was trying with the layout. None of them were quite working right. Um, and we'll see the final one later. Uh, Lighting, I used, par 30 halogens. They're beautiful, but super hot, super a lot of power. Ended up finally with fluorescence and low voltage spots, which I had to reinstall. Building the canyons, these were Bragdon molds. I've got a stack of them like many people do. Hundreds of pounds of plaster, a lot of trial and error about how to blend them together, a lot of trial and error about the right type of paint to use, how to get the highlights and dark washes to work right. But the rock work came out really well. And the rest of the rock material is actually gathered from just outside of Yosemite. They took a bunch of 5-gallon buckets outside the park and pulled a bunch of material that I've been sifting and using. I haven't been buying it from mine mount models. I kind of been sifting it myself, but I know exactly what he's talking about there. The building the trestles was an interesting choice I made. I chose to build them after I put the mountains in instead of before, which I thought was much more realistic. That's the way it's really done, but much more difficult because you had to build each bent stick framed in place, and each one is different. And that was a real labor of love, but it came out, just beautifully, and has a real backwoods feel to it because every bent is different. And um, so I started by running a 1x3 pine stringer across the canyon to make it perfectly level, and then put the underlying stringers and cross tides there underneath it, and then framed in underneath each of the bents to get it perfectly level. And the resulting structure is quite strong. I actually dropped one of the Party 30 halogen lights on it when I was replacing the lights, and it didn't damage the trestle. So here is one being built in place. I've got rollies on there. I'm uh, uh, hand laying the track code 55 track, and then the one in front of it's going to be built after that. So I wanted to flip through in the kind of next section a tour with some photographs of the layout as it is now, of the towns and the scenes in the existing layout. And we're going to start with the upper left, this High Sierra logging operation called Tioga that Mackenzie suggested that I put in. It's we've got a kind of very rough logging operation, uh, and there's the backdrop from the backpacking at Pinecrest, one of two, um, and a trestle on beyond that you can't quite see in the far end there. And here's a PBL Shea moving past one of the spurs. This spur next to the spar tree is code 55 rails spiked to logs that are just thrown down temporarily. And I saw an example of this in Timber Times, where they actually would sometimes just throw down logs horizontal, lay them down in a path and spike rail to them and run the locomotives out and into the forest, grab the wood, and then that might be there for a month or something like this, and then they would take them up and move on. So I decided to try this, and it was another huge labor of love to get all of that level, especially with Code 55, but it worked out beautifully. Here's a shot of another Shay with a train, log cars behind it coming at us, and uh, then the spur off to the right, and again the backdrop, the Pinecrest backdrop there. The next town here is Pinecrest. It's in the front of the layout where it's really a log camp. So yeah, I'm going to be building this out. It is existing right now, but I'm going to be expanding this in the layout expansion to be more of a log camp, the little bit of industry, cookhouse, more bunkhouses, where small warehouse. So some rough facilities for a log camp below the kind of very high Sierra logging operation. This is a scene from the existing part of the town, um, a Shay pulling a series of um, skeleton cars, and also a different backdrop shot of that same rough area within a few miles. The two backdrops were shot within a few miles of each other. The trees are a combination of some I built myself, some Will Cheshire did for me. Beautiful. The lighting was kind of some professional lighting a friend of mine had that he lent me that I was able to use and came out, quite well. Pinecrest also has that major trestle we saw in the front, and here is a photograph of it all finished. We saw earlier the back trestle being constructed, and here it is finished with the one in the front as well, two PBL locomotives, and a backdrop photograph that's in the backdrop, but in the very far background, and that blends quite well into the rock. Okay, so the train from the top is coming from the higher Sierra area down into the log camp, and the climax is leaving Pinecrest to go off uh, the the to the sawmill. Turning to Bear Valley, which is the town that has the sawmill, and it's going to be expanded as well to have some more industry. Um, uh, I'll now show you the opening shot, opening slide. This is the so far dry log pond. I hadn't poured the water in this yet. And that's good because I'm making a few changes to this area. Uh, but this is all scratch built, um, you trestle with code 55 rails spiked down. I used Proto 87 stainless steel spikes in some of these situations, which you can barely see in the photograph. They're super small and work very well for code 55. Can't do that for the whole layout. They're just too expensive. But this is and again, the trees are all from the same source. Another shot of the log pond looking the other way towards a sawmill, a very small backwoodsy sawmill that I'm eventually going to replace with a larger scratch-built one because the town is going to get bigger. And the suggestion of some of my operating buddies, I need to have these be proportional, and I think it's a great idea. So that's what's going to happen there. So that is, and this is the last slide of the Bear Valley town with some um, log, you know, camp, structures in the background, um, and again, more of the scenery. This is the far right corner of that town that's going to be, and you can see the sawmill, just the corner of it in the left hand, bottom left hand side of the photograph. This is going to be expanded into that corner and past that man door there that we can see into a substantially larger town. And I've actually just started working on that framing last weekend. And that's going to provide a lot of operational opportunities. It's one of the reasons I wanted to expand the layout is to be able to do some rudimentary operations, although the layout was not designed for that in as the primary purpose. I'm finding to be a fun aspect of the hobby, and want to design the new sections of the layout to allow for some operational fun, which this will do. Expanding the layout, it, talk a little bit further about that. Uh, I had all of the model making equipment, all of the tables, the storage, everything in the garage. And it took about a year and a half, but I ended up demolishing a lot of that, removing it, moving it all into a tough shed on the property that I ended up, um, sheetrocking, adding wiring, air conditioning, everything else so that I can build models in a model shed that's on that, just at the side of the garage, outside of the garage, and made room for the rest of the layout. Um, Added, and then I've started to add kind of drop ceilings for the lighting and valances. And I've started to do a fair amount of planning with help from my friends around two major operations, the ones I showed you earlier, Big Pine, which is the industry and switching and turntable, which will receive and send, all of the major trains to the rest of the layout, and the mining town that I'll call Panamint after a town in Death Valley, which will have a mill and a mine and switching and a turntable. And also the expansion of the other two towns, Pinecrest, the log camp, and Bear Valley, the where the sawmill is located. Uh, One suggestion that actually came to us, or a small group of us, while having drinks at the Narrow Gauge convention was, "Hey Matt, we need to have another place to operate, and while you're building this, we don't want to rush you. But what if someone were to build some temporary modules for you to append onto your layout, and we could, set those up and run those for switching with the rest of your layout?" For the next 6 months or 9 months or so as you build out the layout. And I thought that's a great idea. So we're talking about that idea to try to get this thing into operations mode a little sooner than it might otherwise happen. So again, the Big Pine town that we talked about, with the sawmill will have, um, industry, and it's not with the sawmill. Sorry, this is the larger town that's shown in the back of the photograph. That's about 22 feet long. It's actually quite substantial, and I've started to put in all the framing for the backdrop with the curved masonite, a drop ceiling, and then mocked up where the layout's going to go, and took the track plan, loosely modified from a plan a friend of mine had on his layout, which has a lot of fun operational opportunities. So that here is the track plan, um, pretty extensive, with an engine house and warehouse and small town, saloon, garage, housing, um, operating turntable, and I think this will keep operators pretty busy at that end of the layout for operating sessions. And I've given some thought. This is new to me, but you've got to really give thought to what are the trains that are coming to a particular town and leaving from a particular town, and what are their purposes. And so out of this town to Bear Valley, where the sawmill is, and Pinecrest, the log camp, I would be sending reefers with ice and food, and flat cars with equipment to drop at the sawmill for milled lumber to be returned, box cars with equipment, and probably a stock car to take livestock up in the spring to the kind of log camp area for grazing, that could then be returned in the fall. Um, so those are some trains that would leave this big town of Big Pine. And then out of Big Pine, the large town, to the mining district called Panamint, I envisioned that we would take, reefers with ice and food and coal for the mill. And I'm imagining it would run on coal, workers, and equipment. The mining town that they'll be building, I want to have a lot of mountainous scenery as well. Um, I want to make this pretty dramatic, like the rest of the layout is. So I'm looking forward to that. A significant trestle as well, and scratch built, structures, for the most part. Um, Probably, the plan is a runaround sidings and turntables again, so I can operate, keep people operational and keep them busy. Um, yeah, I plan to use hydrocal again, and on for most of that portion of the layout, along with another interesting backdrop that I'm looking forward to finding. And this is the mock-up or diagram of what I envision here, with an assay office and bunkhouses, general store, turntable, and the like, trestles on the like, and a mock-up of that town. The trains into that town, of course, it's discussed, would be, workers maybe in a coach, uh, coal, food, equipment, and of course they would take refined ore from the mill back to the main town, Big Pine, and uh, empty reefer cars, flat cars, etc. So I'll have a bunch of different equipment I can run, I hope. Pinecrest, the log town, is going to have extended tail tracks for the runaround, and additional sidings and structures, warehouse, more bunkhouses, and a cookhouse. I envision it will receive small shays with the cut lumber from Tioga, the High Sierra area, and then trains from this town will leave to go to the log pond with larger assembled log cars and a larger locomotive, probably a 3 truck shay or climax, um, and trains in, would be taking workers and everything else that's needed, for the town. Here is a very rough diagram of what I envision this to be. There's a track at the top that goes up to Tioga, the High Sierra area, and trains will come in, uh, past bunkhouses, the cookhouse, and there's a runaround, and places to do some storage for trains, and enough switching that I can assemble a small train and leave this town, going back to the sawmill. And that is my presentation.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was absolutely wonderful. I love the scenery. I'm amazed you were in SM3 at a very early age. So, a lot of interesting, quite a few comments in the chat, which I'll try and go through with you. But thank
Okay,
you. Your cover photograph when you started was absolutely stunning. So that was
I can go
beautiful.
back to it. Yeah, no, it is. The photography is a big part of this for me. So,
No, that's your other hobby, right? So yeah, that
yeah,
one
right.
is
It's kind
absolutely
of
gorgeous.
a couple of hobbies. Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Oh, I understand that. I'll go through the comments here and some of the questions. So Ron, who presented earlier, said he's still using homemade rock molds that were made in the 1980s and they're the best that he has. So I guess those things,
Wow.
we all
Same
have a
thing.
collection of
Yeah.
them. Yeah. Chuck says the bite of a hamburger idea, which I like. He says the bite of a hamburger sounds really just like a module. Just saying. So yeah, I can
Yeah,
see what he's
yeah.
saying.
That was my concern, when that suggestion was made to me, because I had grand ideas. But
Mhm.
and this is bigger than that, so I didn't do that because it is 22 feet by 10, and took,
Yeah.
many years to do this. So it's what time do you have to get it done? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just starting building now, and I'm doing two of your ideas. I'm making it into chunks that can be removed early, so not really modules, but kind of chunks,
Right.
and it's manageable in size, so at least I get something done, right? So,
Yeah.
Ron again says the NCE mini panel is surprisingly versatile and easy to use at a great price. I'm not familiar with that, so yeah.
It really is. And I assume Ron's used it. They're about $60 or probably more with tariffs now. There's a little bit of a learning curve, but if you just call NCE, the main engineer there, I can't remember his name, it's been years, but was really helpful on the phone. And you got to put in detection circuits in the places you
Mm.
want, and you got to have your switches hooked up to DCC decoders to each one of those. But you can make it. It's quite reliable, and it can get pretty complicated if you make it.
Understand, yeah, I'm thinking about control systems and yeah, well, anyway, it's a big deal. Bill Hobbs had a few comments. His first one is that he eventually took over his entire garage in the first house, and my wife's response was to allow me or force him to have a separate building when he moved.
Oh, excellent.
Yes, I'm not sure what the problem is there. So there you go.
No,
Um, and I think this question might have answered itself further down, but Steve McKee asks, what material did you use to make the pine trees from? It looks like Caspia.
it is. Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, he says later on, Will Cheshire was a good friend, so I know what material he used for the trees. And he said he spent a couple of weeks at his house and he taught me how he made those great trees. He
yeah,
said, Will's gone now, but his trees will live on. So
yeah,
cool.
yeah.
And Bill again says he started his first SN3 layout when you were about 6, and he's been looking at your layout and thinking about how much the materials and technologies have evolved or changed since then, which is true.
Right,
When you look
right.
at this photograph, you can see that, right, with the static grass and the grass tufts and things like that. That wasn't there even 10 years ago, maybe. So,
No, it really is amazing. Yeah.